Welcome to the Mysteries Abound podcast, everyone. This is your host, Paul, and this is episode 73. I've entitled this podcast, King John's Lost Treasure. But to begin the show this week, an article from the independent.co.uk website written by David Keyes. The biggest wonder about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon is that they weren't in Babylon. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, weren't in Babylon at all, but were instead located 300 miles to the north in Babylon's greatest rival, Nineveh, according to a leading Oxford-based historian. After more than 20 years of research, Dr. Stephanie Daly of Oxford University's Oriental Institute has finally pieced together enough evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the famed gardens were built in Nineveh by the great Assyrian ruler Sennacherib, and not, as historians have always thought, by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Dr. Daly first publicly proposed her idea that Nineveh and not Babylon was the site of the gardens back in 1992, when her claim was reported in The Independent. But it's taken a further 2 decades to find enough evidence to prove it. Detective work by Dr. Daly, due to be published as a book by Oxford University Press, has yielded 4 key pieces of evidence. First, after studying later historical descriptions of the Hanging Gardens, she realised that a bas-relief from Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh actually portrayed trees growing on a roofed colonnade exactly as described in classical accounts of the gardens. That crucial original bas-relief appears to have been lost in the mid-19th century. When it was discovered by the British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard in the 1840s, it seems to have been already in such poor condition that its surface was, in all probability, rapidly crumbling away. Alternatively, it may have been amongst a group of Layard's UK-bound Nineveh carvings which were lost when the boat carrying them sank in the River Tigris. Luckily, however, an artist employed by Layard had already drawn the bas-relief, and that drawing, recently recognised by Dr. Daly as portraying the garden, has been reproduced in Layard's book about Nineveh, published in London in 1853. Further research by Dr. Daly then suggested that after Assyria had sacked and conquered Babylon in 689 BC, the Assyrian capital Nineveh may well have been regarded as the New Babylon, thus creating the later belief that the Hanging Gardens were in fact in Babylon itself. Her research revealed that at least one other town in Mesopotamia, a city called Borsippa, was being described as another Babylon as early as the 13th century BC, thus implying that in antiquity the name could be used to describe places other than the real Babylon. A breakthrough occurred when she noticed from earlier research that after Sennacherib had sacked and conquered Babylon, he actually renamed all the gates of Nineveh after the names traditionally used for Babylon's city gates. Babylon had always named its gates after its gods. After the Assyrians sacked Babylon, the Assyrian monarch simply renamed Nineveh's city gates after those same gods. In terms of nomenclature, it was clear that Nineveh was in effect becoming a new Babylon. Dr. Daly then looked at the comparative topography of Babylon and Nineveh and realised that the totally flat countryside around the real Babylon would have made it impossible to deliver sufficient water to maintain the sort of raised gardens described in the classical sources. As her research proceeded, it therefore became quite clear that the Hanging Gardens as described could not have been built in Babylon. Finally, her research began to suggest that the original classical descriptions of the Hanging Gardens had been written by historians who had actually visited the Nineveh area. Researching the post-Assyrian history of Nineveh, she realised that Alexander the Great had actually camped near the city in 331 BC, just before he defeated the Persians at the famous Battle of Gaugamela. It's known that Alexander's army actually camped by the side of one of the great aqueducts that carried water to what Dr. Daly now believes was the site of the Hanging Gardens. Alexander had on his staff several Greek historians whose works have been long lost to posterity, but significantly those particular historians' works were sometimes used as sources by the very authors who several centuries later described the gardens in works that have survived to this day. It has taken many years to find the evidence to demonstrate that the gardens and associated system of aqueducts and canals were built by Sennacherib at Nineveh and not by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. For the first time, it can be shown that the Hanging Garden really did exist, said Dr. Daly. The Hanging Gardens were built as a roughly semicircular theatre-shaped multi-tiered artificial hill some 25 metres high. At its base was a large pool fed by small streams of water flowing down its sides. Trees and flowers were planted in small artificial fields constructed on top of roofed colonnades. The entire garden was around 120 metres across, and it's estimated that it was irrigated with at least 35,000 litres of water, brought by a canal and aqueduct system from up to 50 miles away. Within the garden itself, water was raised mechanically by large water-raising bronze screw pumps. The newly revealed builder of the Hanging Gardens, Sennacherib of Assyria, and Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who was traditionally associated with them, were both aggressive military leaders. Sennacherib's campaign against Jerusalem was immortalised some 2,500 years later in a poem by Lord Byron describing how the Assyrians came down like a wolf on the fold, his cohorts gleaming in purple and gold. Both were also notorious for destroying iconic religious buildings. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroyed Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, and according to one much later tradition, was temporarily turned into a beast for his sins against God. Sennacherib of Assyria destroyed the great temples of Babylon, an act which was said to have shocked the Mesopotamian world. Indeed, tradition holds that when he was later murdered by two of his sons, it was divine retribution for his destruction of these temples. Bizarrely, it may be that the Hanging Gardens were the first of the 7 wonders of the world to be so described, for Sennacherib himself referred to his palace gardens, built in around 700 BC or shortly after, as a wonder for all the peoples. It's only now, however, that the new research has finally revealed that his palace gardens were indeed one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Some historians have thought that the Hanging Gardens may even have been purely legendary. The new research finally demonstrates that they really did exist. And from the livescience.com website, a couple of little mysteries that you may have wondered about from time to time. The first is by Joseph Castro, and it's, "Why do dogs eat grass?" Most dog owners have probably seen their canine friend graze on grass at one point or another. A few theories exist to explain this seemingly odd behaviour, though no answer is definitive. The most common explanation for grass eating is that it helps the dogs purge their systems. Like humans, dogs can suffer from gastrointestinal issues. including upset stomach, nausea, bloating, and illness from pathogenic microbes. If a dog is experiencing one of these problems, you may see it frantically wanting to get out of the house. Once out, it will chow down on any grass available, taking large bites and often swallowing the plants whole. The grass causes gastric irritation that leads to vomiting, which helps the dog feel better afterward, the theory holds. In a 2008 study in the journal Applied Animal Behaviour Science, researchers found that while grass consumption didn't often lead to vomiting, dogs that seemed ill before eating grass were more likely to vomit than dogs that appeared to act normally beforehand. Another theory posits that dogs eat grass simply because they want to. In such cases, a dog may appear to hunt for a specific type of plant, rather than ingesting any grass it can find. After identifying the correct grass, it will calmly nibble on the plant. In this scenario, the dog may even be seeking out grass to get additional nutrients it may not have in its normal diet, such as fibre, minerals or digestive enzymes. A 2007 case study in the Journal of Veterinary Medical Science reported that a switch to a high-fibre diet stopped a miniature poodle from regularly eating grass. Wolves and other wild canids are known to regularly eat plant matter, suggesting dogs' grass-eating behaviour is innate and perfectly normal. Indeed, a 2009 dog study in the Journal of Veterinary Behaviour found that puppies were more likely to eat grass if their mothers did while nursing. And also from thelivescience.com, an article by Mark Lananilla. Can you get electrocuted by peeing? A Brooklyn man was reportedly killed by urinating on the electrified third rail of a subway train line. But is that possible? Matthew Zeno, 30, was returning home from a bar early Monday morning on July the 8th, when he chose to relieve himself along the G-train subway line, according to the New York Post. But some analysts are throwing cold water on these kinds of reports, saying it's not possible to be electrocuted by urinating on an electric line. A stream of urine quickly separates into individual droplets, according to the television program Mythbusters. But because the urine isn't a steady stream, it would be highly unlikely that a powerful electric current could travel up it. Nonetheless, though it may be rare, there are a handful of cases in which an individual, always male it seems, has died when a strong electric current travelled up his urine stream. One story recounted by Marshall Hoots in Where Death Delights involves a man named Joseph Patrick O'Malley, who was struck by a train in a New York City subway tunnel, according to the Straight Dope. O'Malley's autopsy revealed the burns on his head of his penis, and the thumb and forefinger were obviously electrical burns. The stream of urine had come into contact with the 600 volts of the third rail. The current had coursed up the stream to cause the burns on his body as the electricity entered it. In other words, O'Malley was fried before the train hit him. Mythbusters also found that peeing on an electric fence can be a shocking experience. Because the fence is higher off the ground than a train track is, urine won't have time to separate into droplets, and the current can travel up the stream. In any case, if you need to pee, it might be wise to find a restroom or a nice private bit of non-electrified shrubbery. Over 20 years ago, a landscaper in eastern Germany discovered a formation of trees in a forest in the shape of a swastika. Since then, a number of other forest swastikas have been found in Germany and beyond. But the mystery of their origins persists. From the abcnews.go.com website, Horticultural Hate, the mystery of the forest swastikas. Blame it on the larches. Brandenburg native Gunter Reschke was the first one to notice their unique formation in 2002. To be more precise, however, it was the new intern at Reschke's landscaping company, Ockerlund Dederow, who discovered the trees in 1992 as he was completing a typically thankless intern task, searching aerial photographs for irrigation lines. Instead, he found a small group of 140 larches standing in the middle of a dense forest, surrounded by hundreds of other trees. But there was a crucial difference. All the others were pine trees. The larches, unlike the pines, change colour in the fall, first to yellow, then brown. And when they were seen from a certain height, it wasn't difficult to recognise the pattern they'd formed. It was quite striking, in fact. As he was dutifully accomplishing the task he had been given, the intern suddenly stopped and stared, dumbfounded at the picture in his hand. It was an aerial view of the Kurzerauer Heath at Zernikow, photo number 106/88. He showed it to Reschke. "Do you see what this is?" But the 60 by 60 metre design that stood out sharply from the forest was obvious to all: a swastika. Reschke is actually a fan of his native Uckermark region of northeastern Germany, extolling its gently rolling hills, lakes and woods as the Tuscany of the north. But what the two men discovered in 1992 in that aerial photograph thrust this natural idyll into the centre of a scandal. Reschke chartered a plane to fly over the area, and indeed a neatly delineated swastika was clearly visible. The local forester, Klaus Gorki, set out to uncover the origin of the troubling larch formation, and he found out that the trees had been there for a long time. By measuring the trees, he came to the conclusion that they had been planted in the late 1930s. That means that for decades, during every spring and autumn, a massive swastika took shape in the Kurzerauer Heath, surviving the Russian occupation, communist rule in East Germany, and the fall of the Berlin Wall without ever attracting notice. The fact that it went undiscovered for so long was in part due to the short period of time each year that it was visible. Furthermore, it could only be seen from a certain altitude, and the airplanes that headed north out of Berlin were already much too high for passengers to see the swastika in the forest. Private planes, on the other hand, were forbidden in East Germany. It didn't take long for rumours to spread about how the swastika got there in the first place. A local farmer claimed that he had planted the trees as a child, with the forester paying him a few cents for each seedling he put in the ground. Others reported that it was put there as a sign of loyalty after a nearby villager had been taken to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp by the Nazis because he had been secretly listening to the BBC. Still another version holds that a local Nazi leader ordered the trees planted on the occasion of Hitler's birthday. Finally, the Berliner Zeitung newspaper reported that it was planted in gratitude to the Reich Labour Service for building a street in Zernikow. Whatever the truth may be, the story began to make waves well beyond the region. French reporters suddenly appeared in Zernikow, eager to fly over the heath to see the swastika for themselves. The Daily Le Figaro published an article on the forest formation that reportedly led then French President François Mitterrand to call his German counterpart, Roman Herzog. Soon thereafter, the German president began pressuring the local forestry office to get rid of the offensive symbol. The effects were immediate. In 1995, forestry workers armed with chainsaws made their way to the copse of larches and cut down 40 trees. They reported back to their supervisors that the symbol was now unrecognisable, and the commotion surrounding the Kursaroa Heath quickly subsided. But the forestry workers were badly mistaken. It took 5 years before their error was discovered. But in 2000, the news agency Reuters published photos of a bright yellow and clearly visible swastika in the forest near Zernikow, even if the edges were a bit frayed. And the media response was once again immense. Even the Chicago Tribune wrote about it, noting that the swastika forest was not helpful for a region that had already become notorious for racist violence. In fact, officials started becoming increasingly worried that the place could become a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis. This prompted the Agricultural Ministry of the eastern state of Brandenburg to plan drastic measures. In 2000, Jens Schade, a ministry spokesman, told Reuters that the intention had been to cut down all the trees in the area. But the BVVG, the federal office in charge of property management, blocked the plan because ownership of some of the property was in dispute and only gave the green light for state forestry officials to cut down 25 of the trees. This was done on the morning of December the 4th, 2000. Forestry workers had to be very careful about choosing which trees to cut down and about making sure that the swastika was no longer visible. They also had to cut the stumps just a few centimetres above the ground so they could no longer be viewed from the air. However, planting swastikas in forests wasn't something that only happened in the Uckermark. As Schade already explained in 2000, this had become a fad among Nationalist Socialist foresters during the Nazi period. For example, already in the early 1970s, US soldiers had complained to the government of the state of Hesse after finding not only a huge swastika on the southern slope of a spruce forest near a place called Asterode, but also the year 1933, formed by larches. A similar symbol reportedly caused a major stir in Jesberg in northern Hesse when it was discovered in the 1980s. And in 2000, a professor of folklore found a swastika of evergreen Douglas firs planted backwards in a deciduous forest in Wiesbaden. In fact, reports soon started emerging about tree swastikas all over Germany. In September 2006, the New York Times also reported on a complete forest near the remote village of Tashbashat in Kyrgyzstan, shaped as a swastika. The origins of this swastika in reverse, measuring some 180 metres across, were also shrouded in legend and uncertainty. One villager claimed that an ethnic German forest supervisor, who had been exiled to the east but was a Nazi sympathiser, directed the planting of the forest in the 1940s. Another reported that the trees had been planted by a mysterious professor in the 1960s before he was taken away by the KGB. A local guide said the trees had been planted in the late 1930s as a sign of German-Russian friendship when Hitler and Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact. Reporter C.J. Shivers also found legends the forest had been planted by German POWs pressed into forestry duty. He never did track down its true origins, but he wrote that, if it really was planted by German prisoners, the symmetry in the tree line may be the Third Reich's only practical joke. And if you visit the show notes at www.origins.info, click on the link to the Mysteries Abound podcast, then on the link to episode 73, and then on the link to this article, you can see the pictures of the forest swastika. As if George Washington hasn't been credited enough with laying the foundation stones of the American Republic, a new discovery might put one more feather in his cap. Our leading founding father could have been author of the country's name. The identity of who coined the name United States of America has eluded historians for years. Online sources vary greatly, erroneously crediting Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and others. But a letter written by Washington's aide-de-camp on January the 2nd, 1776, discovered this past Memorial Day, suggests that Washington might have been one of the first people, if not the first person, to utter the words, United States of America. From the news.yahoo.com website, via the Christian Science Monitor, an article by Ron Delia. Who coined United States of America? The mystery might have an intriguing answer. Previously, William Safire and a bevy of Oxford and American researchers essentially concluded in 1998 that Thomas Jefferson was the originator. Jefferson wrote United States of America in the header of his original rough draft of the Declaration of Independence sometime on or after June the 11th, 1776. Then last summer, the Monitor reported the discovery of an earlier citation in an anonymous essay appearing in the Virginia Gazette, dated April 6, 1776. This latest find comes in a letter that Stephen Moylan, Esquire, wrote to Colonel Joseph Reed from the Continental Army Headquarters in Cambridge, Massachusetts, during the siege of Boston. The two men lived with Washington in Cambridge, with Reed serving as Washington's favourite military secretary and Moylan fulfilling the role during Reed's absence. The letter touched on the colony's desire to enlist Europe's help in their revolution, most likely in procuring much-needed armaments and gunpowder. The shortage of powder was so desperate that at one point orders were issued to use wooden harpoons instead of guns. Moylan wrote that he wished to carry the full and ample powers from the United States of America to Europe to support the revolutionary enterprise. The letter was written at a time when the American colonies were increasingly taking on the trappings of a new independent nation. As historian Kevin Phillips summarises, despite lack of international legal recognition, the Continental Congress functioned as a de facto war government. By the end of 1775, the United Colonies had also created an army, a navy, and even a Marine Corps. When Congress appointed Washington Commander-in-Chief and dispatched him to Boston, Washington called his men the troops of the United Provinces of North America. Washington sought to turn these troops into a fighting force capable of engaging the most powerful military of the age, and at different times, Reed and Moylan worked side by side with him, issuing orders, writing letters, and sitting in council. On Christmas Day 1775, just 8 days before his USA letter, Moylan inscribed on the flap of a document, "On the service of the United Colonies." Yet on January 2, he wrote of the full and ample powers from the United States of America. What could have caused this shift? There are two significant events that occurred between Christmas Day 1775 and January the 2nd, 1776, that could have precipitated the shift in tone. The first was King George III's speech to Parliament, which arrived in the hands of the Continental Army on New Year's Day. In it, George III condemns the rebellion in the colonies, calling his American subjects deluded and their leaders traitorous. He accuses the conspirators as having designs for an independent empire and lays out his plan to expand British land and naval forces in America and seek the assistance of foreign steel to crush the rebellion. For many Americans, this was the last straw. It was their Rubicon. All-out war was now inevitable. The second event, also on New Year's Day, was the unfurling of what is known as the first flag of America, the Grand Union Flag, which featured 13 characteristic red and white stripes with the British Union Jack in the canton. The Grand Union flag was raised by Washington on Boston's Prospect Hill in a ceremony to commemorate the inauguration of the Continental Army of 76, the reformed army that Washington had worked tirelessly to build. It must have been a heady occasion, and perhaps the phrase United States of America was sounded that day. What is known is that Washington understood and practiced the virtue of restraint. He was careful and cautious. His political steps and manoeuvres were well thought out, and although notions of independence were likely discussed frequently among the founders, many of these men were reticent to articulate as much in print. It was something you could lose your head over. Washington later said that he had given up any hope for peace by November 1775 after learning of the King's proclamation for suppressing rebellion. But the King's latest speech went even further and was actually inflammatory. So much so, the Continental soldiers burned it on arrival. For all intents and purposes, the British King accused the Americans of already declaring independence, as Moylan writes to read, "Look at the King's speech. It is enclosed in this, or in the General's letter to you. Will they, Congress that is, not declare what His Most Gracious Majesty insists on they have already done?" The letter from Washington to Reed, mentioned by Moylan, oozes with subtlety and sarcasm. For the calculating Washington, it suggests the veiled language of a man telling his most trusted and perceptive aide that all-out war is coming, and perhaps that it could only lead to a declaration of independence, which happened 7 months later. "We are at length favoured with the sight of His Majesty's most gracious speech, breathing sentiments of tenderness and compassion for his deluded American subjects. The echo has not yet come to hand, but we know what it must be." In Moylan's January the 2nd letter, maybe United States of America was a slip of the pen, so to speak, the idea of a new nation that, until then, could only be whispered. Nevertheless, it is concrete evidence that the phrase United States of America was written and most likely spoken in a home in Cambridge converted to a war office at the dawning of America's Revolutionary Year. Whether Washington, Moylan or even Reed should be credited is somewhat beside the point. In many matters, all three spoke with one voice, the voice of the Commander-in-Chief of what would become the United States of America. There is a reason Sherlock Holmes is the most portrayed literary character in film and television. Everybody loves a good mystery. From simple puzzles to enigmas that run a chill up our spines, we love to wonder. In a world mapped by satellites and rendered into binary code, we relish the idea that there are still things we don't understand. Coming up are 10 exceedingly strange mysteries, from the creepy tales of death and mayhem to the great unknown at the edge of the universe. And for those of you who know that I love to count in my podcasts, an article from the listiverse.com, 10 More Bizarre Mysteries by Mike Devlin. Number 10. Wilberforce Riddle. We'll begin the list with something light-hearted on our eventual journey into darkness. Samuel Wilberforce was a British clergyman who rose eventually to become the Bishop of Oxford. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, advancing the theory of evolution. There was a tremendous backlash from the church, especially Wilberforce, and a debate was staged in 1860 wherein both parties would argue their points. Darwin was too sick to attend and sent acolyte Thomas Huxley in his place. Wilberforce and Huxley locked horns, and while neither definitely won the debate, most would say that Huxley came out on top, even causing a religious woman to faint with this statement: "I am not ashamed to have a monkey for an ancestor, but I would be ashamed to be connected with a man who used his great gifts to obscure the truth." Besides his career in the service of the church, Wilberforce was fond of writing, and riddles in particular. When he died in 1873, he left this one behind. No one knows the answer. Sweetest of sound in orchestra heard, yet in orchestra never have been. Bird in light plumage, yet less like a bird. Nothing in nature has ever been seen. On earth I expire, in water I die, yet I run, swim and fly. If I cannot be guessed by a boy or a man, a girl or a woman, I certainly can. The clues are highly intriguing, and several theories have been put forth, perhaps most notably that he was referring to a whale. But the answer most certainly died with the bishop. Note, perhaps the answer is a whistle. You heard it first at List Verse. Number 9. Isdal Woman. In November of 1970, hikers came across the charred, battered body of a woman in Norway's Isdalen Valley. The body was surrounded by sleeping pills, many of which had been ingested, and bottles of gas. Her fingerprints were sanded off. She was later linked to a pair of suitcases found in a train station in Bergen. Police found all the labels in her clothes had been removed. They also found 500 German marks, a prescription bottle for lotion with the doctor's name and date torn off, and a diary with coded entries. Her autopsy indicated dental work performed in Latin America. It was eventually discovered that the woman had travelled throughout Europe using different fake names. There were other clues. Witnesses reported her in different wigs, changing hotels frequently and speaking multiple languages. Information on the case is scant and hard to come by. A witness came forward 3 decades later, claiming to have seen the woman in the forest, followed by 2 men in black coats, saying the police told him to keep quiet when he initially reported what he'd seen. It is generally assumed that the Isdal woman must have been some sort of spy. 1970 would have been a ripe year for undercover activities in the Cold War. Despite one of the most massive investigations in Norwegian history, the woman's identity will likely forever remain a mystery. Curiously and very creepily, this tale bears a striking resemblance to the Tarmanshud case in 1948, which also involved an unknown victim with tags removed from his clothes, a coded diary, and a suitcase turning up in a train station abandoned. That case is also still unsolved. Number 8. The Atacama Alien. In 2003, a tiny humanoid skeleton was found near a churchyard in a Chilean ghost town. Barely 6 inches long, with a terribly malformed skull, the skeleton, nicknamed Atta, was initially thought to be some kind of alien. The specimen was turned over to Stanford University, where a battery of experts studied it. DNA evidence quickly revealed Atta was in fact a human boy, having died within the last few decades. However, the skeleton remains quite mysterious. It seems to show development consistent with a 6-year-old, and only has 10 ribs to the typical human 12. Researchers believe that Atta was either a very tiny dwarf, or that he suffered a disorder like progeria, which caused him to age rapidly while still in the womb. Others posit that Atta was merely stillborn or aborted, the force of which could have distorted the body. Further tests may reveal Atta's ultimate fate. Number 7. Bloody Benders. In the wake of the Civil War, many Americans headed west, away from the strife of battlefields and burnt cities. If they happened through Kansas and stayed at the inn run by the Bender clan, they were taking their lives into their hands. The Benders were Germanic. The parents barely spoke English, and the children with an accent. And that is about all that is known of their history. The Benders moved to Kansas in 1870 and established a small inn and general store. There were 4 of them: John Bender Sr., who was 60, Ma Bender, 55, and their children, John Jr. of around 25 and Kate around 23. What their actual names were and what their true relationship was to each other, few believe that they were actually blood-related, will probably never be revealed. Travellers often carried with them every dime they had, and the Benders soon realised they could grow rich, robbing their guests. They arranged a set-up wherein guests would sit at a table beneath a trapdoor. When they least suspected it, the male Benders would sneak up behind them, bludgeon them, and then slash their throats. A drop through the trapdoor, and the body could be stripped and robbed. Soon corpses began mounting up in the area. At first, the local Indian tribe was blamed, but when a man and his infant daughter vanished in 1872, his neighbour launched a full-scale investigation, and the focus soon landed on the Benders. Suspicions mounted, but before anything could be done, the Benders vanished. A search of the cabin revealed the bloody room beneath the trapdoor, and 9 bodies were found buried on the grounds. It is unknown what the true body count was, but it is probably safe to say that there were some corpses that were never found. The story was the rage of the day, and souvenir hunters soon claimed pieces of the cabin for their own. The Benders were mentioned in passing by Laura Ingalls Wilder, author of The Little House on the Prairie. She reported stopping in their store and claimed her father was involved in the manhunt for the family, although her account has been called into question. Despite a $3,000 reward, an astronomical sum for the day, the Benders were never found or brought to justice. There are dozens of accounts of their eventual fate, with some saying they were caught by vigilantes or committed suicide, others saying they were caught under different names, and still more saying they escaped completely. The Benders are long since dead now, and where their sinister path took them is lost to history. Number 6. Burke and Hare Murder Dolls. In the late 1820s, 2 men in Edinburgh, Scotland began a grisly cottage industry. William Hare, who owned a boarding house, and William Burke were Irishmen who became friends. When a tenant at Hare's house died, the pair sold his body to Edinburgh University. They quickly realised they could make a pretty penny doing this, but unfortunately bodies were in short supply, so they decided to create some of their own. All told, they killed 16 people, mostly by smothering, and sold their wares to a Dr. Knox at the university. One day, a tenant at Hare's boarding house found a body and went to the police. They managed to dispatch with the corpse before the police arrived, but Burke and Hare's crime spree was over. Hare turned over his accomplice in exchange for his freedom. Burke's fate would mirror that of his victims. After his execution, he was dissected in public. Hair vanished, never to be seen again. But the story doesn't end there. Shortly after the murder spree, a young boy playing in a cave in Edinburgh came across a collection of carved wooden dolls in a cave. There were 17 in all, about the size of a finger, each secreted in its own tiny coffin. It didn't take long for people to realise that the dolls greatly resembled the victims of Burke and Hare in both number and appearance. DNA tests of the macabre toys against the remains of Burke yielded no results. Only 8 of the 17 are still known to exist, and they can be seen at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. Just who created these morbid effigies and what they were meant to represent will never be known. Number 5. The Oakland County Child Killer. Between 1976 and 1977, an unidentified killer stalked the roads of sleepy Oakland County, Michigan, abducting and killing at least 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys. Mark Stebbins, 12, Jill Robinson, 12, Christine Millick, 10, and Timothy King, 11. Mark was strangled and sexually assaulted with an object. Jill was killed by a shotgun blast to the face, Christine was smothered, and Timothy suffocated and assaulted in the same fashion as Mark. Each child had been held captive for several days before being murdered and laid out neatly where they were meant to be found. Jill Robinson was found within view of a police station. The killings resulted in a mass paranoia in the area. Children were rarely left alone for a second, and at least one innocent man was beaten for the mistake of talking to a child. A massive investigation heralded several suspects, but no solid case has ever been built. Recently, some have come to believe noted serial killer John Wayne Gacy has been implicated in the murders, but it seems unlikely, as it did not match his modus operandi of raping and killing older teenage boys. In 1978, the killing stopped cold. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case was a letter written by Timothy King's mother in the Detroit News. Marion King begged her son's captor to let him go so that he might return home and enjoy his favourite meal, Kentucky Fried Chicken. When the boy's body was found, an autopsy showed that the killer had fed him fried chicken. Number 4. Mellified Man. After hearing of the mellified man, you may take your tea with something other than honey for a few days. Ancient Chinese writings tell of an Arabian process wherein elderly men near death would subsist on a diet of nothing but honey. Soon his excrement and sweat would be entirely comprised of honey. The man would soon die from this rather unhealthy practice, and his body would be placed in a stone casket full of honey. After a century or so of aging, the substance is gathered up and used as a medicine, particularly for the healing of broken bones. There are very limited accounts of mellified men, the most notable coming from Chinese pharmacologist Li Shizhen in his Benakao Gangmu. Although honey is never known to go bad, edible honey has been found in the tombs of pharaohs dead for thousands of years, and to have noted antimicrobial properties, especially a protein dubbed defensin-1, the effectiveness of this medicine is debated. Whether the story is mere legend or whether this vile medication ever existed is unknown. Few senior citizens seem willing to come forward and duplicate the experiment. Number 3. Ghost photos. Most ghostly phenomenon can be divided into 2 categories: outright deceit and misidentification. The liars will spin all manners of tall tales, manipulate film and video, and generally do anything to create attention. Then there are those who genuinely believe they have experienced something paranormal. But there are so many things which might lead you astray. A black shadow in the corner of your eye, the settling of an old house, a mouse scratching in your wall. And once the paranoia starts, everything is suspect. Many so-called haunted places feature a prevalence of infrasound, a low-frequency sound that the human ears can't hear, but which we unconsciously detect. Infrasound is often present in the event of catastrophic events, such as volcanoes erupting and the growls of carnivorous animals. However, it can also be produced by sources as innocuous as heating ducts or ceiling fans. Sensing infrasound inspires a dread you cannot understand. However, cameras are not subject to deep-rooted human survival instincts, and there is no shortage of ghost photos in the world. Today, even an amateur understanding of software like Photoshop will allow you to create ghost photos more compelling by far than those produced in the past. Even when photography was in its infancy, techniques such as double exposure could allow for some malfeasance. But there are several images that have been captured by photographers that would have no reason to manipulate their shots, that have been examined by experts and deemed genuine, unexplainable depictions of the afterlife. Some like the Black Seat Ghost, Freddie Jackson, and the Ghost of Boot Hill Cemetery are truly chilling and without explanation. And if you visit the show notes, you can see these 3 photos in this article. Number 2. The Great Attractor. Since the general acceptance of the Big Bang Theory, we tend to think of the universe as constantly expanding from a single core, an explosion like a firework. But there are more forces at hand, some far beyond our understanding. Gravity drags us in all directions. As the moon is drawn inexorably in orbit around the Earth, so too is the Earth by the sun. But there is a far more powerful force at work, one beyond the pale of human comprehension. The Great Attractor is in defiance of everything we have come to understand. It is a gravitational anomaly, some 150 to 250 million light-years distant, that is drawing the Milky Way towards it at 14 million miles per hour. To exert that kind of pull, the Great Attractor would have to possess the mass of tens of thousands of galaxies, and yet astronomers have been unable to find anything matching that description. Even an enormous black hole would be a drop in the bucket in comparison. We may never truly know what the Great Attractor is. Even at the breakneck velocity in which we're pulled towards it, it would take many thousands of human lifetimes to arrive. And finally, number 1. Hinterkaifeck murders. The Hinterkaifeck murders are one of the most chilling and mysterious crimes in German history. The Gruber family was composed of Andreas, his wife Casilia, their widowed adult daughter Victoria, and her children, little Casilia and Joseph. They also had a maid named Maria Baumgartner in their employ. Poor Maria only worked 1 day before she was killed. The previous maid had left because she believed the house was haunted. They lived on a little farmstead called Hinterkaifeck, around 40 miles from Munich. Andreas reported some mysterious circumstances to neighbours in late March 1922. He'd seen a set of footprints leading from the forest towards his farm, but none heading back. Even stranger, he heard footsteps in his attic and found a strange newspaper. A set of house keys went missing, and then on March 31 the entire family was murdered in the barn, one by one, with a pickaxe. They were found a few days later. It was determined that whoever had done the killing remained on the farm for a while. The neighbours saw smoke from the chimney and the animals were fed. While police initially believed the motive was robbery, they dismissed the idea when a large amount of cash was found in the house. To this day, no one knows who murdered the Grubers. The Munich Police Department investigated for decades, but no suspect was ever brought to justice. Some believe the killer was Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel, who'd been branded killed in action during trench warfare during World War I. Karl's body was never found. The music for today's podcast came from the musicalley.com website. The bandwidth is provided by TalkShoe at www.talkshoe.com. The show notes for the podcast are held on the Origins podcast website at www.origins.info. And remember, Origins is spelled O-R-I-G-I-N-Z. If you'd like to keep up to date with the podcast, I put all the information at the Facebook website, www.facebook.com/Paul Rexy, Paulrexy, or click on the Facebook link at the show notes. And if you'd like to provide feedback for the podcast, which is truly appreciated, this can be done through iTunes or wherever else you find the stream for the podcast, or via email. And if you're looking for my email address, it's on the front page of the show notes. Just click on the Contact Paul link. And to bring the podcast to a close today, the story of King John's lost treasure from the Unsolved Mysteries in the World website at unmist3.blogspot.com.au. And this one's written by Tripsabit. John, King of England from 1199 to 1216, is remembered today for many reasons, most of them unfavourable. To children he is best known as the arch-villain in the Robin Hood story, and in history he is remembered as Bad King John, who lost most of the overseas possessions of the Angevin Empire, irritated the barons so much that he was forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215 and lost his crown jewels in the wash. The legend of John's lost treasure has been handed down and grown in the telling for 700 years, largely by word of mouth, and anyone brought up in the fens has heard it from an early age. John was born on Christmas Eve, the youngest son of Henry II and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. As a child, John tended to be overshadowed by his older brother Richard. Like his father, John developed a reputation for violent rages, which led to him foaming at the mouth. Henry left no land to John when he died, so John was given the nickname John Lackland. In 1189, all of Henry's territory went to his oldest son, Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart. In 1199, Richard was killed in France, and John became the King of England. His reign started in an unfortunate way. In 1202, John's nephew, Arthur of Brittany, was murdered. Many in Brittany believed that John was responsible for his murder, and they rebelled against John. In 1204, John's army was defeated in Brittany, and John had no choice but to retreat. His military standing amongst the nobles fell, and he was given a new nickname, John Softsword. The defeat in North France was a major blow for John, and a costly one. To pay for the defeat, John increased taxes, which was not popular with anybody other than John and his treasurers. John also succeeded in falling out with the Pope in 1207. John quarrelled with the Pope over who should be Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope excommunicated John and put England under a medieval church law that stated that no christening or marriage would be legal until the time the Pope said that they would be. Medieval church law said that only christened people could get to heaven, while children born out of marriage were doomed to hell. This placed people in England under a terrible strain, and they blamed one person for this, John. In 1213, John had to give in and surrender the spiritual well-being of the whole country to the Pope. However, the Pope never fully trusted John, and in 1214, the Pope proclaimed that anybody who tried to overthrow John would be legally entitled to do so. In the same year, John lost another battle to the French at Bovines. This defeat resulted in England losing all her possessions in France. This was too much for the powerful barons in England. In 1214 they rebelled. John was forced to sign the Magna Carta at Runnymede in 1215. This guaranteed the people of England rights that the king could not go back on. In 1216, John tried to go back, but this only provoked the barons into declaring war on him. By 1216, John was ill. During the war, he suffered from dysentery. The basic story of his lost treasures, as related by historians from the 13th century onwards, is that King John was travelling in the east of England in late 1216. By the autumn of 1216, John's fortunes had sunk to a new low. He had inherited the mighty Angevin Empire in England and France, forged by his father Henry II, pawned to pay for the Crusades by his brother Richard, and squandered by himself. Having already lost his lands in Normandy to the French king, he had faced a rampaging French army on his own soil, aided and abetted by his own rebellious barons. The previous year he had been forced by them to sign the Magna Carta, reducing the powers of the crown. Although he had won some victories since then, he had earlier been excommunicated by the Pope, and his whole country had been placed under an interdict from Rome. Every church in England was ordered to be closed. On October 9, 1216, though, he arrived in Lynn, one of the few places where he was still popular. He had journeyed from Lincolnshire to Bishop's Lynn, now King's Lynn in Norfolk, but when he arrived he began to feel ill. It was decided that he would return back towards Lincolnshire, which was probably thought to be safer at this time, as the French King Louis had recently invaded the country to the south. On the 12th of October, John attempted to cross the Wash, the large bay that separates East Anglia from Lincolnshire. At this time, it extended much further inland than it does today, and would have been a region of mudflats and marshes, traversable at low tide, but dangerous to the unwary, riddled with quicksand and deeper channels, and vulnerable to rapid movements of water with the tide. The king is said to have crossed over at Visbeck, where it was possible to ford the Well Stream, one of the rivers running into the Wash. Meanwhile, the king's baggage train, which supposedly included all of the royal treasures, including the crown jewels, the regalia the monarch bore during coronation, was also trying to cross the Wash, but was surprised by the tide and got lost amid the rising waters and quicksand. The traditional account of this disaster is well represented by this passage from Charles Dickens' A Child's History of England. Looking back from the shore when he was safe, The king saw the roaring water sweep down in a torrent, overturn the wagons, horses, and men that carried his treasure, and engulf them in a raging whirlpool from which nothing could be delivered. Undone by this tremendous stroke of ill fortune, John was taken to the monastery at Swineshead Abbey in Lincolnshire, where he was greeted with quantities of pears and peaches and new cider. He was taken ill again with dysentery and moved a few more times, eventually dying on the 18th of October at Newark. Historians disagree about many aspects of this tale. For would-be treasure hunters, one of the most interesting issues is the question of what the king actually lost. Although it is traditionally said that he lost the crown jewels, there is no contemporary record that says exactly this. Roger de Wendover's Flores Historium, or Flowers of History, written around 1230, gives the lost loot as treasures, precious vessels, and all the other things which he cherished with special care. Ralph of Cogg's Hall Chronicum Anglicanum describes it as his chapel with its relics and diverse household effects. Another source describes the king's pricely carriage and furniture. In his book Undiscovered, Ian Wilson surveys the theories about John's lost treasure and points out that the official records of the time show that the king was moving round the countryside at quite a rate, sometimes as much as 60 kilometres a day. This suggests that he was not accompanied by a large baggage train, which in that day and age would have been extremely sluggish. So perhaps the contemporary accounts are exaggerated. Set against this is the evidence that genuinely valuable treasure was lost that October day. King John's favourite hobby was collecting jewellery. While as monarch he also owned a hoard of gold and silver plate and other valuables, which he had spent much of 1215 and 1216 gathering together from the various monasteries where it was deposited. Of particular value were the imperial regalia he had inherited from his grandmother, the Empress of Germany, which made up part of his crown jewels. During John's reign, all this treasure is listed in the royal inventories called the Rolls, which John himself instituted, but most of it is absent from the inventory of regalia used during the coronation of John's successor, Henry III, in 1220. In other words, it seems likely that a priceless collection of royal valuables did indeed disappear. The central issue is the probable location of the disaster. The coastline in this region is much changed since the Middle Ages. Drainage projects in later centuries reclaimed a lot of land and radically altered the way that sediment was deposited, and the coastline advanced many kilometres. Weisbeck in particular, which used to be close to the sea, is now several kilometres inland. For treasure hunters this is potentially encouraging because it means that where the jewels were lost is now dry land. But it also means that the paths, fords and causeways used to cross the Wash in medieval times now exist as relics only, occasionally identifiable from the air or as the basis for modern parish boundaries or roads. On top of this, there is serious disagreement about whether John was travelling with or separately from his baggage train, and which route would have been taken in either scenario. Most modern sources confidently state that John was travelling separately from his baggage train. While he had gone the long way round the Wash via Weisbeck, his train was taking a shortcut across the Wash, presumably to make up for the fact that it moved more slowly than he did. As Wilson points out in Undiscovered, however, the contemporary sources specifically state that the king barely escaped the disaster, which suggests he was with the baggage train when it was overcome. If the train was indeed carrying his collected loot, he probably would have been loath to let it out of his sight. Safety would have been a particular issue because of the unsettled times, and the fact that the fenland of Lincolnshire was hostile territory where the Norman monarchy had never been popular. This area had been the haunt of the 11th century rebel Hereward the Wake, a historical figure who was one of the main sources of the legendary Robin Hood. These considerations are of prime importance because it is known that John did cross the well stream at Weisbeck. If his baggage train was with him, it must have crossed there too. The well stream no longer exists, but the River Nen follows more or less in the same course. Wilson describes 3 theories about the exact site of the disaster. For many years the traditional view was that the baggage train crossed separately from John, travelling from Cross Keys on the western side of the Wash to Long Sutton on the eastern side, and being overwhelmed near present-day Sutton Bridge. Many treasure hunters have looked in this area without success. Historian Gordon Fowler, assuming that the baggage train was with the king, has pinpointed the likely crossing point of the well stream as being just between Weisbeck and Wolsoken, although today these are now more or less the same town. He even suggested an explanation for the disaster: the sudden appearance of a tidal bore, known as an eager in that region, which is where a tidal surge funnels water up a river as a series of large, potentially destructive waves. A third candidate, based on the theory of historian J.C. Holt that the traditional crossing point of the well stream in those days was to the north of Weisbeck, between Walpole and Foul Anchor, puts the location near modern-day Tidgoat. There is evidence in this region of a medieval quicksand bed which ties in with the contemporary accounts of the disaster. More recently, a fourth candidate has emerged, based on a reconstruction of the exact tide tables for that day in 1216, which suggests that the baggage train would have got further than the well stream by the time the rising tide caught up with it, and was probably crossing the mouth of the Welland River at modern-day Fosdyke, to the northeast of Weisbeck. With so many candidate locations, it is hard for a treasure hunter to know where to look, and any search will not be helped by the 10 metres of soil believed to have accumulated over the previous ground level in the last 800 years, which puts the treasure well beyond the range of normal metal detectors. However, this may be only part of the problem. Various subplots and intrigues behind the traditional story suggest that the treasure may not be there after all. After John's death, rumours proliferated that he had been poisoned, probably via those quantities of pears and peaches and new cider laid out for him by the monks of Swineshead. Although most modern historians discount these rumours, not everyone agrees, and medieval conspiracy theories have been advanced based on the coincidence between the loss of the king's treasure and his untimely death. Another theory suggests that the crown jewels were not lost at all, but were either sold or used by John as collateral for loans, with the Wash incident being staged as a kind of misdirection or medieval fraud. Whatever maleficent plan the king was hatching was cut short by his premature death or murder, and the treasure was subsequently stolen. At least one contemporary report speaks of suspiciously heavily laden men seen leaving Newark in the wake of his death. There's absolutely no evidence for this, but it makes a good story. The ailing king made it to Newark Castle, where he died aged 49 on October 18, just 2 days after re-entering Lincolnshire. He was buried at Worcester, minus his missing regalia. Maybe someone else did make off with the loot and the lost treasure. The Wash story was just a ruse to cover the glaring absence of the jewels. Certainly it reinforces the negative image of King John that even recent revisionist historians have not been able to change. We have to ask if a suspicious character like John would really travel without his most precious jewels. If the treasure is really buried somewhere near modern-day Sutton Bridge, then it would be covered by 20 feet or more of silt, so we can all put our metal detectors away. But that hasn't stopped people looking. During the 1930s, a group of American treasure hunters paid local farmers 2 shillings and sixpence an acre for their help in looking for the jewels at Walpole Bridge. More recently, a team from Nottingham University took soil samples in a bid to discover the causeway the wagon train used. The search goes on. We may never know the truth. In the 14th century, it was commonly rumoured that Robert Lord Tiptoft had salvaged the treasure, setting himself up as a wealthy man in the North Country on the proceeds. According to East Anglian folklorist W.A. Dutt, local legend in the Sutton area talks of King John's Hole, a pool where the jewels were hidden, either by John himself for some nefarious purpose, or by those who recovered them after the disaster in the Wash. The pool is said to be on the southern side of the King's Lynn to Long Sutton Road. But it is possible that this booty hidden in the hole has already been recovered. In the 14th century, local Baron Robert, 3rd Lord Tiptoft, suddenly became immensely wealthy. There was no apparent source for his sudden affluence, and rumours spread that Tiptoft had discovered King John's lost treasure. So perhaps there is nothing out there left to recover. Well, everyone, that concludes episode 73 of the Mysteries Abound podcast. Hope you enjoyed today's show and didn't miss not having a paranormal story. Maybe I'll do one of those next time. Well, I've done 2 podcasts in 2 days and I'm a little brain dead. Episode 145 of The Origins and episode 73 of The Mysteries Abound. It's a little bit unprecedented and has taken me 2 full days to put together. But I had some time and I haven't done many for a while, so I thought, why not? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the shows, and until next time, this is Paul saying bye for now, everyone, and keep well.